Oh, that's an old copy.
I think it's the same.
Better be.
We're gonna share.
It'll be close enough.
I'll take it.
Okay.
Well, damn. What I do.
You can hold the whole of the talk surfaces here.
Did you open the book?
No.
Well, because I was gonna moment ago, so yeah. Yeah, I think that's
How much was it?
on the tape. I don't know. What? I downloaded it. And I downloaded it, it was 10, but there's some inconveniences to have it like that.
I did hard here.
I think it was the weather forecast, correct?
I know.
And it's really cool and sassy. The way it is. So I don't know.
Okay, I'm gonna ask you guys to
As long as
do.
it stays on the mountain, like, enough with it. Yeah, enough with it in my backyard. No. But once is enough.
The name and the big, oh, you got it. Oh, history.
Oh, no.
If you're new to this, put the name on it so that we can see it. If you don't know your own name, then put it on both sides.
Can I put somebody else's name on?
No.
Oh.
Then I'll throw it at the wrong person. Diane, you need a book? Or do you have a book?
I ordered it, but I did. Yeah, I did.
Just your first name, big letters, fold it like a tent. The Scott here is make a tent, put your name on the front. That's so that when I start stuttering, I can remember who I need to talk to. Got a couple. They'll be around here in a little bit.
Ed,
Pat doesn't know his own name, her own name.
are you gonna do an introduction to the class?
Do I need an introduction?
Yes, you do.
Oh, actually, I'm going to do a strip tease act.
Oh,
I think I saw your wife across the hall. I better call her.
Yes.
Yeah, we're so talented in here. Well, we have a busy, I don't know, didn't I advertise it? I think it's around $12. Huh? Well, I'll get some cash and get it back to you. Either that or I'll have a nice party.
I don't know. Because I bought it. I bought my own ones.
Well, some people have downloaded it online.
Yeah, how much are the books?
I think they're 12. Yeah.
I have 11 or I have a 20.
I would take the 20.
Well, you give us a 20.
Give me the
give
11 and I'll throw another $1 in. And, okay, I'm going to get that taken care of. I need to get those feet back.
Ed,
Yes.
some more.
Some more. I love s'mores.
A few classes down.
I'm a little muddy. It's really strange. It looked cold, but it was actually warm. But tonight when we go home, I'm sure it's going to be.
Well, I said, because I was walking in from the car into this building, the temperature coming down. That was really warm this afternoon.
Our bucks, we want to
You want a book? God. Some people it's impossible to
I
please.
was really trying to divine the whole thing.
Okay. Okay. We got a lot going on tonight. Across the way they are going to be introduced to a possible new pastor. No, it's not that Mark guy. Jonathan Armpriester, yeah. Go for it.
Look at Megan and I'm making a list of policies we want. Very good. Passing it on, the things we require in our
This is coming at a kind of I think an opportune time. I think in Lent, I think everybody in here knows me, but I'm Ed, Rev Ed Denham. I paid a lot for that.
Ed #1.
Almost blood. But I think in terms of Lent, there's Alan. Or Robert, I'm sorry. Bob.
Thank you.
Alan, Bob, Alan. So in Lent, it's a time for us to kind of consider who we are as Christians, what our relationship is, to do a little bit of self-examination and self-evaluation. And I think this course is that kind of a course. I'll state right up front that I think much of the stuff that you're going to hear from Adam Hamilton, you already know. You know, you're not going to really hear anything new, but maybe you'll hear it in a different way. Maybe through our discussions we can come up with some right ways to live our lives so that we are maybe more appealing as Christians to a world that seems to be becoming more and more and more and more non-Christian. Other faiths are growing, and our faith is growing as well in certain areas, but maybe not in the right way. So I think we have a lot of work to do, and I think Lent is a good time to do this study. It's not a new study. It was 2010, I think, was when it was written, and then republished in 2014, maybe. So it's 5 years old. And definitely you can tell that it's been a while because as you watch the picture of Adam Hamilton in our video, and then if you go online and see some of Adam's podcast today, you'll see a more mature individual like most of us. So a couple of things that took place in the last few days that I want to encourage you to maybe seek out, and I can't bring them into the classroom, but you can seek out online and look and find. The first is after the General Conference, you all know who Adam Hamilton is in Church of the Resurrection. Mm-hmm. Church of the Resurrection is the largest United Methodist church in the world, located in Kansas City. They have multiple satellite churches, quite a large staff of pastors that serve these satellite churches. But the central main church in Leavenworth, Kansas, or not Leavenworth, anyways, Kansas City. Leawood, that's what I was, thank you.
He's a Missouri side.
But it's a very large church. But he sat down with his congregation for about an hour, which was recorded as on podcast, and you can get online and you can check it out. The actual video I've got, I'll put on the board. It's a Vimeo video. So you download Vimeo, Vimeo, and then you can watch this online. It's kind of like YouTube, but it's just a different server. But it's called Next Steps, and he's talking about next steps for his congregation, and also describing why he feels the way he does. And it's a very remarkable. It's an hour-long video, but it's something I would encourage you to seek out. You can go to the Church of the Resurrection website, and then you can find it there. And if you have any questions, you can ask, and I'll help you with that.
Is the website .org?
It's, well, you just have to Church of the Resurrection, and they have downloadable study materials, and it's called Serve Church or Share Church, sharechurch.org. You go to sharechurch.org, then you can look up and find a lot of things that you can either download or you can view there. But that's where you can get it. That's a Church of the Resurrection website that they've set up to share their materials. The second item is today on NPR on Terry Gross. If you know who Terry Gross is, she interviewed a longtime Episcopalian priest by the name of Barbara Brown Taylor. And Barbara Brown Taylor was an Episcopal priest still is, but she's retired. But the last, I think 12 to 15 years, she's taught at Piedmont College. I think in Georgia. And anyway, it's a very good interview. You can go to NPR and you can to Fresh Air, and you can see. I don't know whether you can download a video of the interview, but you can definitely see a script of the interview that they did. But they were interviewing her because of a new book that she has just published, and it's called Holy Envy. And Holy Envy is, the subtitle is Finding God in the Face of Others. At Piedmont College, she taught religious studies. And so she was teaching all different kinds of, hi Noreen, come on in.
What was the subtitle again? Finding God?
Finding God in the Face of Others. So she's, the orientation of the book is about how in her relationship with other faith systems, she found God, more fully or in different ways. But Barbara Brown Taylor she's an interesting and I think a very well-founded scholar and priest and preacher. I've admired her for quite a number of years. She's written quite a large number of books of sermons and other books. But I just would encourage you to maybe check her out, especially as part of this is how this study is how do we relate to other faiths, another religion. So, Noreen, do you need a book?
I have an electronic copy.
Okay. Any questions before we get started?
Where's the school located where she taught or teaches?
It's in it's kind of in the mountains of Georgia, I think. Piedmont College. It's not Appalachia. It's can't think of the name of the mountains that they have there. Well, it's south of there, south of the Blue Ridge Mountains, I think. Let's. Well, I gave you an introduction, George. What more do you want?
Just let us know when we're going to begin.
We have begun. I'm going to share an opening prayer with us, which is written in the Leader's Guide, and I think it's good words. Dear Lord, we acknowledge that we all act in ways that are unchristian at times. Each of us struggles with the tendency to have wrong motives, be critical and judgmental of others, miss the point, and be insensitive and mean-spirited. It is so easy to point out the sins of others while ignoring our own, major in the minors while failing to do the really important things you demand of us, and pretend to be something that we are not. When we act in these ways, we are not following the example of love that you model for us and taught us to follow. We are recovering Pharisees, Lord, and we know that only by recognizing our tendency to be Pharisees do we have the hope of remaining in recovery. Teach us to be more like you, Lord. Fill us with your Spirit so that others will see fruit in our lives. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control, and be drawn to follow you. Amen. There's some guidelines, and I'll, when I get the computer worked out, we'll put some of these on the screen so that you have those to remind us. But here's some reminders. The purpose of the study is not to debate the beliefs or opinions, but to help you hear and understand the perceptions and feelings of young adults outside the Christian faith. Some issues and beliefs are complex and multifaceted, and therefore will result in multifaceted perspectives. Yet as followers of Christ, we are called to demonstrate respect, acceptance, and love toward those to whom we disagree. This session is not intended to be a debate or a gripe session, but, well, I maybe ought to leave. But an opportunity to grow as disciples of Jesus Christ as we learn more about the perceptions of young adults and how we can be more like Christ in communicating and interacting with those who are outside the Christian faith. Be willing to let go of your biases and to question your assumptions. You will agree with some points and disagree with others. But as you are willing to see things from the perspective of young adults outside the Christian faith, you will come to discover how you may be more influential representative of Christ in a skeptical world. So those are kind of the guidelines that he has put forward for his study. And I think now we'll start by trying to watch the video, if I can make it work. You may have noticed this.
George, the lights.
Over the last few years, I have found an increasing frustration on the part of younger adults with Christianity. They haven't necessarily been frustrated with Jesus. They wear crosses, even though they don't go to church. They have t-shirts that look like spiritual t-shirts. They're interested in Jesus. They just aren't very interested in Christianity. Like Gandhi, of a conversation he had with E. Stanley Jones, the great Methodist missionary, years and years and years ago. Gandhi said to him, I love your Jesus. I just don't see very many Christians who look like him. And that, I think, would capture the sense of many young people. Today, 40% of persons aged 16 to 29 have opted out of the church. 20% are considering themselves atheists or agnostics. The rest are spiritual, just not interested in the church, Christianity. And recognizing that part of that 40% are your kids. They're people who were baptized in this church. They're cousins or nieces or nephews or grandkids. It's important for us to figure out why have they opted out of the church. Now you say, well, yeah, but when I was a kid, I stopped going to church when I went to college too. But it's not quite the same today. I mean, these aren't kids who just went away to college and mom and dad weren't making them go to church anymore and they decided to take a break for a couple of years. What these young people are saying is, we reject Christianity. We don't necessarily reject Jesus, but we reject Christianity. And when asked why, the primary reason isn't theological. It's the Christians they've known. Now this is important for us to listen and to hear and to understand and see how we can go from getting it wrong to getting it right. Now let's begin by recognizing one of the top reasons why these young people have said they're turned off or really repelled by Christianity. What Kinnaman did is he put together a list of 24 adjectives and 12 positive, 12 negative. And he gave these to these young people that he was interviewing who were outsiders. And he said, would you pick the ones that best describe Christianity or Christians? And the top 5 responses he gave, or that they gave, were words that you wouldn't want to be associated with. The third most frequently given response was chosen by 85% of these young outsiders. And the response was that the Christians they've known are characterized by hypocrisy. They're hypocrites. So that's what we're going to focus on today. Let's talk about hypocrisy for a few minutes. Now, the word itself comes directly from the Greek, so it's transliterated in English from the Greek hypokrisis or hypokrites, and hypocrisy, hypocrites. It meant literally in Jesus' day, it was a positive term in some settings. If you worked on the stage in the theater, you were a hypocrite. A hypocrite meant an actor, or somebody who was pretending to be something else. It was not a bad term if you were in theater, but when Jesus uses it in the Gospel of Matthew 13 times to describe the religious leaders, he doesn't mean it in a positive way. He's saying they were pretenders. They were play acting at being the people of God, but they hadn't really got the point. This, I think, is the hypocrisy Jesus was talking about. And it's interesting, William Barclay, who's one of the great New Testament scholars and Bible teachers, deceased now, but he once wrote this. He says, of all sins, hypocrisy is the easiest to fall into, and of all sins, it is most sternly condemned. Well, Jesus did speak a lot about hypocrisy. In fact, some have suggested that the reason he was crucified by the Jewish authorities, the Romans crucified him, but the Jewish authorities insisted on his death, the reason for that was because he exposed their hypocrisy. And I want us to take a look at a little of what Jesus said about hypocrisy in the Gospel of Matthew. And I want to ask this question. Is there anything that he says to the first century Jewish leaders that might apply to 21st century Christians? Okay. Let's take a look at the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 6. Jesus says this, so whenever you give help to the needy, do not sound a trumpet before you as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, so that they may be praised by others. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward. And then he continues, and whenever you pray, do not be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and at the street corners so that they may be seen by others. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward. And once more he says, and whenever you fast, do not look dismal like the hypocrites, for they disfigure their faces so as to show others that they are fasting. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward. That's interesting. You know, these folks were giving to the needy, they were praying, and they were fasting. Those are all good things to do, I think. So what was the problem? Well, the problem was their motive. They were giving to the needy so that they might be seen by other people and praised for what they did. They were praying beautiful prayers in front of as many people as would listen, or maybe quietly, but in front of people, so that folks would notice and they would affirm them. They were fasting, but they were making sure that everybody knew everything they'd given up for Lent, so that people would think they were spiritual. So their spirituality wasn't really about connecting with God, it was about winning the praise of other people. This was their motivation. Do you think Christians ever struggle with these things today? In the 23rd chapter of the Gospel of Matthew, the entire chapter is devoted to hypocrisy. So everything in there, Jesus is saying, is about hypocrisy. And it's this chapter that likely got him killed. All right, he's in Jerusalem. It's the last week of his life. He's already come in on Palm Sunday. And now he takes on the Pharisees, the scribes, that is the religious lawyers, and the religious leaders. And one verse after another, he says the same thing. Woe unto you, scribes, Pharisees, you hypocrites. I'll just read two of the passages to you. You can read the rest of them on your own. Matthew 23. Matthew 23, 23 and 24, he says, Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe the herbs in your garden, but have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faith. You blind guides who strain out a gnat but swallow a camel. Now the Pharisees had developed an intricate set of laws to govern their daily life. And the word Pharisee itself means separated or set apart. And they wanted to be holy and pure. I mean, that was a good motivation. They wanted to be righteous before God. They wanted to please God. And so then they tried to figure out, well, what could we do to really please God? And they took the law and they took it to the nth degree. They made sure that Jesus gave the example of their tithing. They didn't just give 10% of their income. I mean, you wonder net, gross. Well, of course it was gross for them, but it went beyond that. In their gardens where they had basil growing, they would cut every 10th basil leaf and they would give it to God. Every 10th plant of oregano belonged to God. I mean, every little detail. And all of that sounds good. But somehow when they focused on the minutiae, they forgot the really big important stuff. They began sort of looking down their nose at everybody else who didn't measure up. People were in or out based upon whether they actually did all the things that the Pharisees said to do, and people who were sinners weren't to be associated with. They were out. Other people were out also. The Sadducees were out. The Essenes were out. The Herodians, to the degree that they didn't line up with the Pharisees, they were out. Any religious group that didn't believe exactly as the Pharisees believed was out. So I think, that our young adults who are outsiders have something to teach us, or at least remind us of when it comes to how we ought to be as Christians. I mean, they've told us, 85% of them have said, that when they think of Christians, they think of the word hypocrite. And I think they mean all the things that we were just talking about.
85%.
I think they mean that not every Christian, in fact, most of them will say, no, I met a good Christian once. I saw one that was really, what Christians ought to be. But they all have stories of Christians, more than one, that to them seemed not righteous, but self-righteous, judgmental, morally superior in their attitudes, making other people feel small. They seemed narrow-minded, mean-spirited, and they looked to them much more like the Pharisees than the Jesus that they claimed to follow. And with Gandhi, they would probably say, I think I like Jesus, just not Christians. Now I have a confession to make to you. It's not any big revelation. I'm a hypocrite. I see this person that I want to be, and I am not him. I see this person that I want to be who never has an impure thought, who is always loving all the time, who's patient and caring and concerned for everyone, whose heart breaks whenever there's tragedy, who is willing to sacrifice and give up a great deal in order to make sure that people have enough, who no longer cares about luxury or things that don't really matter. I see this person who is going to be bold and courageous and and always doing the right thing. Except I'm not him yet. I want to be him. I pray every day to be him. I pursue the spiritual disciplines to be him. But I'm not him. And here's the thing I think most non-Christians, the outsiders, I don't think they're expecting us to be perfect. I don't think they ask that. I mean, it's interesting, one of these young people said to David Kinnaman, he said, listen, it doesn't bother me that you Christians are hypocrites. We're all hypocrites. The problem for me, he said, is that I know I'm a hypocrite. And I'm not sure you do. I don't think they're asking for us to be perfect. I think they want us to be real. I think they want us to want to be what we say we are, and to at least make progress in that direction. I think they want us to be like Jesus. And that leads me back to this passage of scripture that we read at the very beginning of our service. It's a really great one. It's from Luke chapter 15, where Jesus is about to tell the stories of the 100 sheep, and one of them wandered away, the lost sheep, the parable of the lost coin, and then the parable of the lost son, the prodigal son. And the reason why he tells all those parables, he's telling them to the Pharisees, is because of this verse. He says, that Luke says, now all the tax collectors and sinners were coming near to listen to Jesus. And the Pharisees and the scribes were grumbling, saying, this fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them. Don't you love that? That's what the religious authorities said about Jesus. He welcomes sinners and he eats with them. Did you notice the sinners were drawn to him? They were drawn to Jesus. He didn't make them feel small. He made them feel big. He didn't condemn them. If there was anybody who could have been self-righteous, it was Jesus, but he wasn't self-righteous. If there was anybody who could have gone about picking apart other people's lives and their sins, it would have been Jesus. He could have done that. He had every right to do that. It's just that he didn't do it. Instead, when he talked to them about God and about life, he made them want to know more. And then when he talked about these things, he made them want to be more than they were before. To long to be more like him. And so the sinners were drawn to him. And that's, I think, what he's looking for from us. Is that when we love with his love, when we welcome people where they are, when we're authentic and real, when we encourage instead of pick apart, I think people will be drawn not only to us, but to the Jesus we represent. 14 years ago, it was a week very busy, and I needed to have a meeting with Dan, our youth pastor. Dan Entwistle was our youth pastor at the time, and we hadn't been able to have our regular staff meeting, and so I'm a night owl, and Dan's a night owl, and I called Dan up, and I said, hey Dan, how about if we meet at 10:30 tonight at Patio Quigley's Pub down the street, and we'll have our staff meeting there. And so he said, yeah, sure, that sounds great. So your senior pastor and your youth pastor meet at the bar down the street, and we have our staff meeting there. And before I left the house, I had on a Church of the Resurrection sweatshirt, so I showed up there at Patios with my t-shirt or sweatshirt on, and we sat down, we had our staff meeting, soft drinks and appetizers, and after a while, people started popping by our table. The barmaid came over, and she pulled up a chair. She said, can I sit with you for a minute? I said, sure, have a seat. She said, I see your sweatshirt. Is that church is down at 109th or 135th and Row? I said, yeah, that's the one. She said, do you go to that church? I said, yeah, we both do. And she said, do you like it? I said, yeah, I really like it a lot. She said, well, here's why I'm asking. She said, my life's not going very well right now. My marriage has fallen apart. I have a 3-year-old child, a little boy. I've been a pagan witch for the last 8 years, and that's not working very well for me. And I feel like I need something else in my life. And what I wanted to ask you was, do you think that church that you go to, would they welcome a single mom who's been divorced, who's been a pagan witch for 8 years, and who works as a barmaid at Patio Quigley's? And so I can tell you without hesitation that the people of that congregation would welcome you with open arms, and they would love you, and you wouldn't feel small there. And she came the next Sunday. A little surprised to see me in my pulpit robe preaching. But I got her a Bible, and that was the beginning of her journey in Christ. And part of what I realized in telling that story is, that was 14 years ago. It's been a long time since I showed up at a bar with a Church of the Resurrection sweatshirt on. Too long, actually. But I also realized it's been 14 years ago, and 14 years ago, most of you were not a part of this church. We're a different church today. So I just have to ask you this question. Are you still the church that's going to welcome women whose lives are falling apart, who are in the midst of a divorce, who've been pagan witches for 8 years, and who work as barmaids? And I don't mean to be melodramatic, but I just have to tell you, if you're not that kind of church, I don't want to be your pastor. I think these 40% of kids who are outsiders, I think they really matter to God. I think He cares a lot about them. And I want us to figure out how we can be the kind of Christians that when they see us, say, I want to know more about Him. Every week we'll do this. This is what they've taught us about when Christians get it wrong. But we do or can get it right. And I think when we get it right, it's pretty simple. We're not perfect. We're just trying to be like Jesus. Not even perfect like Him. Just willing to love, willing to accept, willing to welcome people. And that's my hope and prayer for you.
Yeah.
I'm going to Kansas City.
What are some of the high points that you heard?
I think he's very cool, and I was surprised how young he looks.
That's why I said you ought to look at some of his later work.
Is he the one that took us on the tour of John Wesley's house?
Yes,
and
yes,
everything?
yes. Yep.
I like his speaking voice. It's just speaking, it's not preaching.
He's got that Midwest, spit it out quick. What any particular insights that you heard?
The minute they said,
Pardon?
the minute they say hypocrite, the first person I think of is that in the character, the church lady.
The church
You
lady.
cannot get any more hypocritical than that one.
And that was the point of that.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
And I've experienced this as a pastor of a church in a downtown area where you are confronted with people coming to the church for assistance. People outside believe, people outside the church believe that your church is there to help. They believe that Christians are compassionate, loving, giving, helping people. Now, I'm not just talking about youngsters, I'm talking about adults, but I guess that struck me several times as people came up, and I can say, well, gee, you don't give to the church. What do you do for what we're helping you with? But just the fact that they knew what the church was about. And what I feel, the church is not for us who are in the church. The church is here for those who are not in the church. Sounds kind of oxymoronic, but that's really the truth of it. And here's some insights that he wanted to get across. That most non-Christians know that Jesus stood for love, which is why it feels particularly off-putting to them when those that claim to follow Jesus act in unloving ways. He hit that point and this came out when I was reading several books. As a matter of fact, there was a book titled, it was part of the emerging church literature, books that were published. The title of one of the books was "They Love Jesus, They Hate the Church," and that was part of the emerging church routine. Jesus taught that God's primary role was to love, and that God's interest wasn't in condemning those who were sinners, but in drawing them to himself. Jesus warned his followers about 4 things related to hypocrisy: wrong motives, judging others, majoring in minors, and being two-faced. I think two-faced is kind of synonymous with hypocritical. Well, all of them are. That's and I'm sure, looking around the room, most of you have lived long enough that you know somebody in each of those categories, if you aren't yourself. So, yes.
I think everybody's hypocritical sometimes. I
Yes.
call it situational hypocrisy.
And that's his point. That's why he said, I'm a hypocrite. And each one of us are. How do we overcome that in terms of our relationship with others?
Acknowledging it.
Acknowledging it, and one more step.
Acting on it.
Compassion. Acting compassionate. Showing compassion. Some of you have been through the walk to Emmaus, and at the end of that, on the last day, one of the last talks has a line in that talk that says basically, you've been through these 4 days, you've learned, you may be a better person, you may be a better Christian, but that doesn't make you better than anybody else. And I think that's a pitfall that we get into. Many of us are active in the church, and we're doing good things, and we're doing, and sometimes we fall into the trap of thinking, well, I'm a rung or two above on the ladder than that person, and we begin to look down, and that affects how we deal with people, and it especially affects young people. Young people can denote, if you're talking down to them just a little bit, it's a big red flag. A big red flag. Not saying that it doesn't affect us adults, it does. It affects us adults as well. One of the things I learned from working with youth, starting 35, 40 years ago, was that they can smell a hypocrite about 50 miles away. I mean, it shows up. What's the old line, you parents? What's the hypocritical line? Just do as I say, not do as I say. But what is the compassionate thing to say? You don't always do it right. But let's do it together. Let's try to do the right thing. And kids know right away when mom, dad, parents, brothers, sisters, family are doing something that they're told not to do, man, what's the first thing they're gonna do? I don't want you smoking. They're out the door to buy their first pack of cigarettes.
You know what my mother did? She bought my cigarettes after a while. She said, "'Cause I don't want you smoking somebody else's cigarettes, smoking after them."
She didn't want you getting them out of the gutter.
I did anyhow.
Well, the point is, you know, this whole study is based upon 85%, how 85% of young people outside the church think of us.
But I think what bothers me, that we're all hypocrites. Everybody.
Yeah.
Why are they criticizing people for being hypocrites when they are and their friends are and everybody else they hang out with?
Because of that statement that the child or the youth told the researcher. Yes, we realize we're all hypocrites. We just don't think you know you are.
That's rather judgmental.
Well,
I
it
know I'm a
is.
hypocrite.
That is. But are we going to lower ourselves to that level? See, that's what I think we've done for too long. We've lowered ourselves to a level below what Christ calls us to. What does Christ? Let's look at Galatians 5. I'm getting ahead of myself. But if you've got a Bible, well, I'll get a couple.
His room's full of Bibles.
I know, you think I'm so liberal I don't use the Bible, but
What? Who said that? Recovering hypocrite.
some of you know what it is without looking at the Bible, but Galatians happens to be in the New Testament. No, it's way back in the back. It's one of Paul's letters. It's Paul's letter to the Galatians, and it's chapter 5, verses 22 and 23.
You know, this thinking of yourself better than other people. I love this phrase that my sister says, which is, God doesn't just love you. He's crazy in love with you, just like everybody else.
Yeah, crazy in love. Who's got it? Scott, go ahead. Loudly.
But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Against such things there is no law.
Read that a little more slowly for me. Love, joy,
peace, forbearance,
Patience.
kindness,
goodness,
faithfulness,
Generosity.
gentleness, self-control.
Oh, that's anybody have any trouble with that?
This one today.
Now, somebody had patience. That's forbearance, right?
Yes. Okay.
What are some other words?
Generosity was in my.
Generosity was probably part of goodness.
Before faithfulness.
Yeah, goodness. It was generosity. Okay.
Oh, we have the wrong version.
No, you just have another version.
I'm just kidding.
Any other words that are different? See, I think this goes back to the point, Barbara, is that we realize that we don't even live up to our own expectations. That's what Adam is saying. I don't live up to the expectations I even have for myself. How many of us make resolutions at the beginning of the year and fail to follow through? And how many of us, because we've done it so many times of failing to follow through, we don't even do it anymore?
I don't.
You don't?
It's nothing to making
Okay.
No.
Well, but the point is, we don't live up to even the expectations that we put for ourselves, let alone maybe the expectations that we think Jesus has put onto us. But really what Jesus is calling us to are these living lives with these characteristics as part of who we are. And I think, here, I'll tell you about a pet peeve. I started a food bank in the Coolidge, where I was serving and worked, and I got a lot of guff because we didn't make those who came to get food sit down and listen to a sermon or read scripture or worship, or we didn't put a requirement on what we gave. And my feeling was if I did that, I was selling the gospel. And it takes me out of goodness and generosity. It takes me out of having kindness and peace, or gentleness.
Not loving either.
It isn't loving because we're taking the love out of it. We're selling it to somebody. Okay? And I think frequently churches get involved and say, well, we have to get something back, or we have to make them do something for that, or they aren't going to see it in the right way. And but from the other side it looks hypocritical. From the other side it looks hypocritical. But I think these are the answers. These are the answers to how do we get beyond being seen as hypocritical. We get beyond that by being loving, by sharing. And when we fail, you apologize. You acknowledge that you failed. I remember saying some things to a woman in the choir. I didn't realize what I was saying at the time and how hurtful it could be. And when she shared how hurt she was, I had to apologize. No, I didn't intend to do that, but I failed. And that's what we do. I don't think Christians apologize enough. Some people think, well, we're not apologizing enough. But when, for instance, what has the church done in the past? Well, in Colorado, a pastor who was part of the Colorado militia took part in the Sand Creek massacre. Massacred hundreds of women and children. Do you think the church ought to apologize for that?
Yeah.
Yes. And keep apologizing, because those until it becomes sincere for the people whose roots come from slavery and the abuse that those who have received through slavery, pain that's not only physical but economic and social. The church was involved in a lot of that. I know we sometimes think, well, that was another generation and we're not there, but that's part of it. We are called to apologize personally, but from time to time the church has to apologize as well. And so I think that's how we move. And sometimes you apologize for things that you really don't feel like you need to apologize for, but you know that it is the loving, caring, peaceful, kind thing to do. And it costs very little.
We're seeing a little bit of that with the political speeches that the candidates for president or for the next election Some of them are refusing to have those conversations, and some are encouraging it.
I know that this could be a difficult topic, but I think those characters, that's one of the reasons why many of the young, they don't see the church in the way in which they know what the church should be. And yes, we don't live up to their expectations, and we may never, but at least we can be apologetic, forgiving, acknowledging our failure, and try to do better. I think that's part of what I think we live in a culture that's been driven by business and by the legal profession. If anybody's a lawyer in here, I apologize, but I'm sorry.
Paralegal and none taken.
But because of our culture in this country at the present time, we are all quote unquote insured. As a consulting engineer, I had to carry errors and omissions insurance, and so the company, I became controlled by the mores of an insurance company and their legal profession to say I was never allowed to admit any wrongdoing. Now, I don't think I ever committed any really bad things, but yes, when you have a complex project, you leave some things off the drawings. You know, it's a process that takes a lot of time, and sometimes things get missed. You have to apologize and work around those things. Although there's many times your insurance company won't allow you to admit that. And that's kind of become the culture that we all live in. We may not realize it, but that's we've continued to be told, never admit you were wrong. Never admit you're wrong. And I don't think that's the Christian way. That's not what Christ would call us to. Yes.
You see it particularly in the televised congressional hearings, where the one side is trying to get them to use a loaded word,
yes,
and the person refuses to use the loaded word. They're both wrong.
But it's into that situation where what would be so bad about admitting that we didn't do something perfectly or we didn't do something quite exact? Well, it's loaded.
One example was trying to get Kirsten, whatever, to say they were in cages, and she would not say cages. And the whole intent was so they could have her on film, right, saying cages.
So, you know, the reality is that we as Christians, I believe, are called to a different standard than the culture around us today. We're called to a higher standard. We're called to a more compassionate and loving standard. Was there any confusion about how motive enters into this?
You know, I have grandsons that are in high school, and there's just so much other stuff,
right,
out there that when you put up 85%, say hypocritical, I don't think there's 85% of the population that know what hypocritical means.
That may be true.
You know, really, and then if you go a little bit older, you know, young adults, there has to be two people working And if they have children, they have to have childcare.
Mm-hmm.
And how are you gonna arrange all of this?
Well,
So, really, the church has a real problem,
yes.
reaching these types of people and having programs for them.
You bring up exactly the issue is that the church can't sit on its campus and wait for them to come in. The church has to be out there in some way. We've complained about soccer games being on Sunday on fields, but there's nothing to prevent the church from being on the soccer field as well. And you set up a tent in the corner, and when they're between games, they can come and sit down and maybe take communion, or they can come and sit down and have a prayer, or if they want to talk to a pastor or whatever, there's somebody to pray with them or whatever. There's ways in which you bring up an exact point, and that's part of the call that families are seeing is, why isn't the church out here where we are? Why are we being asked to come to where they are? Now, eventually, maybe they will come to where we are, but I think we're called to make that first step.
For the sports program, I see some of the people that I worked with at Scraps down here coming to that. I saw them at the Halloween, and they didn't have any connection with the church. They just saw the flyer. It was something their girls liked to do, so they came, and we'll see what happens.
Well, I think that you can do special things like that to invite people in, but I think Alan brings up a good point, is that families are so overcommitted today that saying, well, you gotta come to church, or you gotta come get your kids involved in our youth group, or those kinds of requirements. You're just putting another thing on their plate that they don't have time for already. And so the church has to, what does that mean that we have to do? We have to sacrifice a little bit.
I think that one of the big things that our church is doing is youth sports.
Yes.
I'm not involved now, but I was involved initially when I could move around a little bit.
Well, no, it is good, and I think it provides an arena for kids to be here, and we're probably reaching a group of kids who don't have a majority of the kids who come and participate in that are not connected with our church in any other way. And so that is good. I'm not saying we're not doing some good things. We are. I think we are just called to do more.
I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not affiliated with anything related to law field at this point. But isn't society, I was involved in youth sports also for a while. I loved it. But at 7:30 when practice ended, some of the kids on my team were walking home through the neighborhood. I felt like I should be giving them a ride home and things like that. But at the same time, legally, I'm understanding what I'm putting myself.
Yes, at risk.
I would put the church at risk also if I'm giving them a ride home and something does happen. And then I'm driving home, and I live in Corona, Tucson now, and what I'm seeing all the way home is the nightlife of the big city in the United States. And that wore on me. So, I was a coach for a long time in public schools, and I'm not sure legally what you said could be done on a public school soccer field.
Well,
you have to be very, I don't know this for a fact, but I do know that you have to be very careful how you do it. I mean, if you're giving out, I think this is, my point is, and I'm long-winded and I'm a storyteller, so I'll try to get to the point. I think society today is moving more and more toward restricting us as Christians. As a public school teacher, I think for what I did good, this really bothers me too, today. For what I did good, I mean, I realized, I was street savvy, and I was in the service, etc. I realized right off that by admitting that you made a mistake is the best hook for a young person, for sure. You know, if you try to pretend you're perfect all the time, you're the best coach on the world, and you're perfect. It wasn't your mistake, you put the blame on the kids or whatever, man, you're done. But I just think, my point is that society to me today is moving more and more toward restricting what we as Christians can say, give credit about. Like I said, my own personal point is I think I gave credit for the things that I did good to everything except for where it really came down to, which was I hadn't lost my faith when I thought I had. My faith was still working through me most of the time in rough situations where a lot of times I felt like, well, you know, I'm not really doing it the way that Jesus would have done it. I'm not sure if that's coming across, but my point was that I think society today is making it harder and harder for us to move outside the grounds. I mean, what we do good here on these grounds, I mean, I love the prayer before practice. I love the prayer before a game. And just what we were asking them to understand about sportsmanship and what this competition is about. This is a sport. This is basketball. And it's not life and death at this point. It's not. I just think we're getting more and more restricted.
Well, I think that may be true, but there still is nothing against any of this. And a lot of the games that I was talking about are not on, they're not school sports. They're
Club
league
sports.
or club sports.
Yeah.
And so, you know, they're on a public field someplace, that in a park or, you know, they may, sometimes they're on a school, but it's not a school sanctioned sport. It's a league or a club sanctioned sport. And so, and I'm not saying you go out there and stand on a street corner or stand on the corner of the field and you know, do a witness. I'm saying your presence is the witness. Your presence is the witness. You're being kind and friendly to the kids who are around. Your willingness to interact with them and to be present for them. You can say, we're from St. Paul's United Methodist Church. You can have a sign that says that. You can say hi. That people, you know, you don't have to go out. People will come up and ask if they're interested. But you're in their arena, and I think you're present. I don't think that. I'm not necessarily saying that I'm not asking you to go out and to convert. Not asking you. I'm asking you to be out in the middle of where they are doing these things. Being kind, being generous, sharing yourself in some way.
I don't have any problem with that. I have trouble hearing everything that was said, but if I heard some of it right, I think the quote governmental restrictions are much more difficult now.
Oh, they are.
Than they were. I was involved in the Little League for several years, and it seemed that every time that we did something, you know, it had to be approved and this and that.
And I realize that, but the point is, yes, there's still ways that we can be out there. There's no, again, I'm not talking necessarily about evangelism. I'm talking about us letting those people out there, people with faces, people with lives like ours, who you know, later on we'll hear a little bit more, and this will make a little more sense. But at some point, somebody may ask, why do you follow Jesus? And and you're not gonna like what I'm gonna say next. If you answer, because Jesus saved me, you're liable to have lost them. Unless you can describe what that salvation is about. What you need to say is, you know, I follow Jesus because Jesus loves you, Jesus loves me in my present. Well, your answer needs to have some bearing on the life transformation that they're looking for.
Well, because Jesus tells you how to live. And all of those things, I mean, you can do those everywhere you go with anybody you're with.
You can.
You treat them, you act in that manner, and you treat them with love.
Yes.
It's got nothing to do with proclaiming your Christianity or anything else.
Exactly.
But Jesus is telling you how to live.
Exactly. I am the way.
Mm-hmm.
I am the way. That's what he means. I am the way. Here's how you live. Here's how you live. What I think I've shared in this group, the word for faith, the word for faith in the Greek is pistis. It's more trust, but it is also, it's more of a verb than it is a noun. We should be saying, I'm faithing. In other words, it's an active word. Faith is not something that we hold on to. Faith is something we do. This is how we show our faith. That's how we live it out. There's some other, while we have our Bibles and that sort of thing, there's some others. He mentioned, I think, chapter 23. He's got a couple of verses here, 5. Does somebody want to look up 5:43 to 48? And somebody else look up 22. This is Matthew 36 through 39.
Well, if you look, I can read it. I didn't know.
And in John 13, 34 and 35.
Matthew, this is Zechariah. Well, there's this kind of excitement. Matthew what? 5. Matthew 5.
Matthew 5:43, 48.
Okay, you have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward have you? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you salute only your brethren, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? You therefore must be perfect, as your heavenly Father is perfect.
And how does Luke phrase that? Luke does not use the word perfect. What word does Luke use? He has basically that same verse is in the Gospel of Luke. Luke uses compassion. Be compassionate as your Father in heaven is compassionate.
I like that better.
Somebody have so what's the difference here? What does Jesus teach that's different than, what is he telling the people that they haven't heard? Or it's not that they're loving. What is he asking them to do in terms of love?
Yeah.
Love your enemies.
Yeah.
Care about them. What does it mean to love them? To want the best for them. How many of us want the best for China? How many want the best for
North
Korea?
Your friends.
Iran? Pakistan? best, I think, is what would God want for them.
Which would be good for everyone.
Yes.
So,
Well, you want their goals to be achieved, you know, in some way. You're praying for their success. But, you know, our understanding of success is having a relationship with God and doing God's will. So we can pray in that fashion. But wanting that for our enemies, I think, is a new thing. Still a new thing. Still a new thing. Okay. Somebody have 22, 36, 39? Lord?
Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? Jesus replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself.
We've heard that. What is in our brothers and sisters of the Jewish faith? What is Jesus teaching them? Or what? The brothers and sisters in the Jewish faith already have this as one of their commandments, and it has a particular name.
Well, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly. Shema?
Shema.
Shema.
Love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, and your mind. Love your neighbor as yourself. That's not exactly accurate, but that is the heart. So, and if you look at this one, who is our enemy is even our neighbor. and so that anybody that says that they love God, and I think Jesus says this somewhere, anyone who says that they love God and hates their neighbor is a hypocrite. That's right. And John 13, 34, 35. We'll get to that in a little bit. Just hold on to it if you do. John 13, 34, 35.
Was 34?
John 13, 34, 35, yes.
A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another, even as I have loved you, that you also love one another. By this all men will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another.
Okay. So, we are to be known, first of all, we are to be known by our love for each other. What do you think is being done when the church is in the news and obviously we're not loving each other? And it's in the news that we're not loving each other. And see, that just moves us into this category. I know these are difficult issues and we haven't solved it, but I'm just saying that's why if we can't solve our issues within the boundaries of the church, it is damaging to the gospel. And so one of the things that I believe is that having votes on matters within the church is contradictory to peace and goodwill within the church. That consensus building is what is needed within the church so that there does not become winners and losers. So that we have both, some of us are not going to totally go along, but we're not going to stand in the way. It's not exactly the way we do, but we will compromise and move together, and we will work out ways in which we can all become more involved in our church or involved in our relationship with God and with Christ. But when we are dividing ourselves up to winners and losers, it's always going to go outside the church. So we're not showing love to ourselves, and so those outside the church know that if we can't get along within the church, why do we want to join a group like that? So the solution again is finding ways in which these can be our ways of dealing with each other, even within the church. We have to learn to do it within the church, and then we can learn to do it outside the church as well. How did Jesus treat sinners? As equals, right? I like that word, as equals. He didn't talk down, didn't look down on them. He recognized the difficult situations they are in. I mean, if you taught and you coached, you knew that some kids come from some pretty difficult places. Some kids come from privileged places. Doesn't mean that one kid is any better than the other. And we have to learn to work through that. Matthew 6:2. I know somebody's got it on the Bible. Matthew 6:2.
So when you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets, to be honored by men. I tell you the truth, they have received their reward in full.
Okay. Addressing the motive. Fasting is a good thing to do. Most of us need to do more. Prayer is always good. Giving to the poor is always good. But if you're doing it for the wrong reasons, I don't think it's beneficial. And that's part of why I have a bit of an issue with using salvation as a means. That means I'm getting something for my love of Christ. And I don't think it works that way. Now, yes, I also think that salvation is another way. I think sometimes we're joyful because we got something out of our relationship with God, and I don't think I think that's a side issue. We shouldn't make it a major issue. That's a minor, and we're not dealing with majors. A major is we follow Jesus because He has the way and the truth and the life. Life is better here, now, when I'm following Jesus. That His teachings bring truth to me. They ring true when I follow what Jesus invites me to do. I know that when I show compassion, goodness, generosity, and faithfulness, I feel better about myself, and my relationship with God is better. Definitely my relationship with others is better. So I think that's why we follow Jesus. I got a lot of other questions. We've already been through Galatians. How many of you got this written on your mirror? In your bathroom? Go home tonight, get your lipstick out. Write it on the mirror. I think we all need to have that on our I'm tempted to use a line, but I'm not going to. The Palin line.
I didn't see that on your mirror when we were over for Thanksgiving.
Doesn't mean I can't put it on.
No. Practice.
Keep me straight, George. Keep me straight.
ask something?
Yes, please.
When we had the church meeting on March 2nd, that Saturday, a lot of people at the end of that meeting felt that they had not had a chance to have their say and that there was no vote. And now, hearing you present it the way you did, I think I understand better that there is more harmony and peace in a church when you don't have a vote. Everybody just has to move towards center.
Well, I think you have to have the discussions. You have to give people the opportunity to have a voice and to share their voice and to share why their voice matters and how it works for them. And the reality is consensus takes a lot longer. I mean, you have to, and see that was one of the things that was so disappointing to me about the special general conference is the bishops established the commission to come out with a way that we could move forward all together. And the way that the commission worked on it is they worked on it in consensus. In other words, they stayed at the table. They didn't all agree. They did not all agree. But they all stayed at the table, and they got to a place where more than a majority, like 2/3 of them, were in favor. There was a small group that said, we are not in favor of this, but we're not going to stand in the way, and we will support it. And that's what consensus does. It says, okay, we recognize that this is the direction that, and there's a lot of prayer involved to see where God would lead, and there's a lot of scripture study involved. All of this took place within the commission, and then we went to a special general conference where they voted on something. And you ended up with winners and losers. And that's what became such a dichotomy with me. And I think that's kind of hypocritical for us. Yes?
Forgive my ignorance, but so I went to the March 2nd thing, and I don't understand, like, for instance, what did one have to do to become a delegate? Are you appointed as a delegate?
No, they're elected at our annual conferences. So we, in our annual conference, because we're a small annual conference, we only got one clergy delegate and one lay delegate from our annual conference. Excuse me. Some of the reality is there's a lot of complicating factors, but in the western part of the United States, the population is much less than it is in the east and southeast and other parts of our country. So we don't get as many delegates to general conference as some of the others, and unfortunately, and this is true politically as well as religiously. Not everybody is more liberal, but there's a higher percentage of liberality within the West than there is in the East, and so there's a lot of issues around that. That's how they are elected, but and generally the people that we sent to annual conference are open and affirming people, because that's how our conference in the last last 12 to 15 years has come out more and more vocally for supporting gay and lesbian people. So that there's been lots of votes on our annual conference floor addressing this. Does everybody agree? No. But
well, Ed, I'm sure that we'll discuss this more later in one of these other chapters.
Yes, we will.
But as I understood it, basically, you know, there was 2 proposals, right?
Well, there were at least 2, there were more, there was probably 3 or 4, but there were 2 main proposals, yeah.
Okay, but, the African church, they have a real problem because a lot of that's
Yes.
political. And how can the Church of Liberia be, quote, somewhat liberal when the government says absolutely no?
Well, that was the point of the one church plan. It gave the African, in the one church plan, the African church could keep they could minister to their culture in the way that it was.
Right.
And so, and it allowed churches to be, yes, we're going to deal with this more, but, and that's why,
that was what was voted down.
that was voted down, yeah. And the traditional plan that was passed, and now we don't know what the total outcome of that is because the Judicial Council has to look at that and see if the changes that they made as part of that fit within the Constitution that's still standing. So, our Constitution, the United Methodist Church Constitution.
So
the rules and law.
Then it is a bit different from the way we're operating right now?
A bit. As I said earlier, the plan is a little bit more
Restrictive.
I think, I think we haven't, the bishop hasn't shared much about that. On the 28th, all of the pastors on the 28th of this month, all of the pastors in our annual conference are invited to sit down with the bishop, and I think he's going to share more specifically with all of the pastors what his vision is going forward. And then that hopefully will mean that the churches will hear a little bit more than what you heard on the 2nd or 3rd.
And does that include you and Billy and Ed?
Yeah. I don't have, retired pastors don't have to attend, but I think probably we will. I plan to anyway, just to.
I just wanted to make sure that didn't exclude you guys.
No, we're not excluded, but it's not mandatory. But see, that's the whole point of in the United Methodist Church, and I'm diverging a bit here, but I'm still ordained. But what changed when I retired was I'm taken out of the appointed process. So when the bishop calls and says, "I need you to go to so and so, to a certain place," I can say, "No, sir, no, ma'am," without, really. I mean, not that I necessarily would, but I think that you're just taken out. You don't have that responsibility of being itinerant.
A question on that. The next normal general conference is next year.
Yes.
And it's in Minneapolis.
Yes.
And it's just looking with the way that this is kind of being slow up, that's going to come up again in Minneapolis.
Most definitely. Most definitely. And that's what many of the bishops are. Adam Hamilton put it this way. He said, in writing a letter to his more conservative friends who supported the traditional plan in writing, he says, "I thank you for doing this because now you have just thrown down the gauntlet and you're going to see, you're not going to like what you have just created by this decision." So, I mean, that's his approach. His view is that this is going to cause people to really become involved and make their voice known. So we'll see if that happens.
Sounds like a good thing.
Well, could be a good thing. Yes, 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 right. And maybe some other things will be worked out associated with that as well. So, you guys are gonna, next week, we're gonna do chapter 2, so we're just gonna keep bouncing through, and as I said, there's not much new, it's fairly easy reading, so you don't, I mean, but the key idea tonight was this.
Read the first chapter.
Hypocritical. And if you don't think you are, you probably are.
I just think that I'm not pronouncing that word. I always thought it was hypocrisy. So
well, it is hypocrisy.
He kept saying hypocrisy, and I'm like, I'm saying that.
Well, I've always pronounced it hypocrisy, but it is high. Now you did it.
I'm an engineer also, and I was curious. I looked it up. It is hypocrisy.
It is hypocrisy.
I think he either was using the ancient Greek pronunciation, or he was mispronouncing, so we would all remember hypocrisy.
Well, I think
his main message.
I think hypocrisy is the probably maybe that's the Midwest approach.
That's what I was thinking.
I think he was mispronouncing, so we remember it.
It doesn't change the meaning. Take the meaning.
There we go.
Take the meaning. All right. One of the things
should be very interesting.
One of the things that, yeah, well, I think it gets better when we get to, if you can find the next steps after General Conference. I think he had he called it the church family meeting. And I think it was on the 5th of March is when he held the meeting, and so that's the date. But if you can find it, if you look for it and can, then give me a call and I'll see if I can give you some more information and get you closer to that. But it's a 1 hour basically lecture. It's not a lecture, but he shares with his congregation what he experienced at General Conference and why he is where he is, and he talks about the Bible, and I agree with him. The Bible is at the heart of much of what we are in disagreement about, and so it's just a really good study chapter. If you can find it, I think you would find it to be very helpful. So, happy to help you with that. In wrapping up, my experience with non-religious people is that they are not expecting Christians to be perfect. In fact, one young adult said, I don't mind that you Christians don't live up to your ideals. I don't live up to all of mine either. So we're not called to be perfect. But if we I think it'll help us if we understand that our faith is a journey. It's a faith journey that we're on. None of us have arrived yet, and there's more for us to explore. And if we will understand that we're on a journey and others are on a journey with us, it'll help. Dear God, we want to be filled with your love and goodness all the time, but we're not there yet. So sometimes we're tempted to fake it, and that can get ugly. Help us to live authentically in your love and grace, letting go of our need to look good even when we aren't. Teach us to own our struggles and to claim your power to transform us. Amen. How did Paul say the same thing? For all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. All. All.
Wait for the meeting, you said.
Scott, you want to take everything from me.
I don't worry about it.